This section of notes, we're going to be looking at culture. First thing in regards to culture of Russia that I want to look at is the religion. Now, what you see here in this pie chart, you'll notice that this says this is the main religious groups in Russia. Russia and the Soviet Union was a little bit different. Think back to the Soviet Union era. Soviet Union was a communist-type government. When you have a communist-type government, the government really doesn't want there to be a religion out there because that essentially puts somebody or something as more powerful than the government, and that's not what communist government wants. During the Soviet Union, atheism, which is the belief that there is no supreme being, was kind of the religious group. 70% of people during the Soviet Union were non-religious or atheists, and there was only 18% Christian, and most of that was the Eastern Orthodox. And then you only had 10% Muslim. Since then, since the Soviet Union's kind of fallen apart, you see a resurgence of religions a little bit. And this pie chart here kind of shows you that Eastern Orthodox, in fact, is still the majority with 45%. We still have 46% here that are non-religious. I would even say that that's probably even less. These people are probably scared when there's surveys and things, scared to admit that they are religious because they're afraid of government repercussions. And then you have this 8% here, the Islamic people, which is growing in the area, and then some other religions are not notable percentage-wise. And then moving on to education. Today, in Russia, literacy rates are close to 100%, which is really, really good. Reason it's so high is during the Soviet Union, they pushed for free education and a free education system because they really valued education. Now, a lot of that education was on communistic principles in the communist government, but they did improve their educational system. In fact, some of their science was ahead of the United States science back during the Cold War as they launched the first unmanned satellite into orbit with Sputnik. They beat the United States. NASA was created as a reaction from Sputnik and the Soviet Union's efforts. And the Soviet Union's scientific research kind of propelled the United States to focus a lot of time and energy on that because we didn't want to fall behind. Russia's limited economy has hindered the educational budget. So really and truly, the educational system in Russia is getting a little worse since the Soviet Union because the free higher education is no longer a possibility. And then healthcare. Disease, lifestyle choices such as smoking and drinking, and inefficient healthcare systems all threaten the well-being of Russian peoples. The movement to a more free enterprise system has helped the healthcare system, but it still struggles today. This chart here shows you how the Russian GDP, gross domestic product, is actually increasing since the fall of the Soviet Union. This is in billions of international dollars. You could see some drops here and some drops here, and even here at this point you're going to see some drops. So the economy is getting better, but there's still a lot of things like education and healthcare that sometimes take a turn for the worse because it's no longer free. And then there's a case study that I want to look at of Transcaucasia. Transcaucasia is just a fancy word of talking about Russia south of the Caucasus Mountains. In this region, you've got Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then just south of there, you've got Central Asia and Southwestern Asia. The Caucasus Mountains on the northern border of the Transcaucasia region isolates these people, and there's an abundance of languages and different ethnicities, and this has created many, many cultural differences in this area that's different, made these people different than the regular Russian people. And it's kind of an isolated region that's kind of a world in its own. This mountain barrier is a physical border that blocks communication and transportation and trade, and it keeps them isolated and keeps them kind of in their own little region. And so it's allowed for these independent cultures to be created, but then also to be sustained. And then last thing I want to look at in regards to culture, in a lot of the areas of Siberia and in some of the other Central Asian Republic regions, the traditional culture or the culture of the past is kind of prominent. Traditional culture, the definition is maintaining lifestyles of the past Just when you see traditional, you're probably thinking old, and that's exactly what this is. This is the old culture. In the barren regions of Siberia and in a lot of the Stans regions, people live in what's called yurts. I've got that spelled there in the sky above the yurt. And people living in these yurts, you could tell that they're very nomadic peoples. They're hunter-gatherers following the herds around because their houses are semi-permanent houses that they could easily pack up and move. Then your last section of notes, it's called Living in Russia. It's probably the most important section of notes of the whole unit. It's kind of the theme of the whole unit that I'm going with and what I want us to really, really focus on. And that's living in Russia and the changing economic spectrum. Remember the economic spectrum, which I've got here at the top. On the far, far left, you always have communism, which is 100% government control. The government always makes decisions in regards to the economy. And then the far right is 0% government control. The government has what's known as a laissez-faire, or a hands-off approach to the economy. And in the middle is socialism, where the government controls big business, and then people still have privatization. They could still own things. First subsection of living in Russia is changing economies. Since the fall of communism, Russia has faced many economic challenges, such as providing more jobs for its citizens, increasing food production at home, and expanding trade internationally. They've had a long history of what's known as authoritarian type of rule. And an authoritarian type of rule is where the government is very strong central government and controls everything. And predominantly throughout the history of Russia, that's what you see. The first part of the economic spectrum I want to look at is the Soviet command economy, with the Soviet flag there in the bottom left of your picture. Under the communist leaders, the Soviet Union operated under a command economy, which is where central authority makes all the economic decisions. This could be government officials, the head of the government, and that's just they are the ones that's deciding what to produce and how much of it to produce. The government during this time period owned banks, factories, farms, mines, and even the transportation systems. Members of the State Planning Committee decided how much to produce, how to produce it, and who would benefit from the profits. They also controlled the price and even where it would be sold. The Soviet government emphasized what was known as heavy industry. Heavy industry is the manufacture of goods such as tanks and other military hardware, machinery, and electric generators. The Soviet Union focused on heavy industry because they wanted a very strong military, because during the Soviet Union time, the whole time they were at war, during the Cold War. As a result, the Soviet Union became an industrial giant and a world power. They were an industrial giant because they produced so much things in regards to industrial production. Now, people were working, but their jobs were not the best types of jobs. It did make the Soviet Union a world power, but its people could not buy many consumer goods or goods needed for everyday life, because most of the goods that were being produced were the heavy industry type goods, which are not consumer goods. So although they were making a lot of stuff, the stuff was not for them. It was for mainly the military and the government, so that they could succeed. During this time period, the major agricultural production was small subsistence farms. And when your major agricultural production is just producing food to survive off of, you can imagine the amount of food shortages that would take place because of it. And then we have the market economy. This is where businesses are privately owned. And you can see on my drawing here about where they would fit during this time period. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985. This is when the Soviet Union was still around, and he was trying to keep the Soviet Union intact by shifting the spectrum to the right. In a market economy, supply and demand rule the economy. That's what all the democratic nations during this time period were doing in regards to the economy, and their economies were doing really well. So Gorbachev decided that, maybe we need to shift the spectrum a little bit so that we could succeed as well. So that took power away from the government, and it shifted their economic spectrum a little bit to the right. Things offered for sale in a market economy are what's known as supply. That's what's being sold. And then people's desires to buy those things is demand. If people are demanding a lot of something, then the supply is going to be high, and that's what's going to be produced. So essentially, everything that's being produced is being used, which is a good thing in regards to economies. Gorbachev reduced government control under what was known as perestroika, and then Boris Yeltsin, which we'll talk about in a little bit, came in and even expanded this process. Gorbachev used perestroika and glasnost, which was a policy in regards to international trade. And by doing so, he did help the economy out by shifting the spectrum, but there was still work that needed to be done. And then we move on to what's known as privatization. Privatization is a change to private ownership of state-owned companies and industries, such as mining and oil extraction and processing. Boris Yeltsin is credited with this privatization effort, and he shifted the spectrum even more towards the right. And you can see on that chart that we've been looking at, with Yeltsin, you did have some ups and downs, but towards the end, we had some ups. As countries broke away from the Soviet Union, Russia started to lean more towards privatization, which shifted their economic spectrum to the right, in hopes of appeasing countries and keeping them in Soviet Union. Now, their appeasement efforts did not necessarily work. A lot of republics in the Soviet Union still broke away, but it did help the economy out of Russia overall. Russia experienced and is experiencing an increase in consumer goods, and their economy continually expands and improves because of this shift in the economic spectrum. And then you can see in the chart that we've been looking at, after Yeltsin, you have a guy by the name of Putin. And with Putin, you have an increase. And then we had Medvedev after Putin. And with him, we had even more of an increase. And then we come back here in this other area, the brown area again. I've covered it up because of my drawing abilities. It's Putin again, and we have an increase. Now, you do have another dip after this in 2014-15, but still, overall, spectrum is getting better. Economy continually getting better from where it was during the Soviet Union.